Hello, welcome to the Today Christian, a program designed to help the contemporary Christian answer some of the difficult questions that challenge their faith. If you are interested in knowing the truth, then you are the right place. My name is Oxford and I'll be your host. Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, made this profound statement. He said that when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed, and by the time we opened it, they had the land and we had the Bible. The philosophy around the statement that he made has made a lot of Africans grow some form of resentment towards the Christian religion, because a lot of Africans today believe that Christianity sponsored the Western occupation and also the slave trade that occurred on our continent in the 15th century. Today we are looking at Christianity and slave trade. Did Jesus command his disciples to go and make slaves, or he commanded them to go and make disciples of all nations? That's what we are looking at today. Let's go straight into it. Now, the concept of slavery has already been in existence. When you trace humanity to some of the earlier civilization that we know, like the Sumer civilization in ancient Mesopotamia in 3500 BCE, the institution of slavery was already in practice, where certain individuals in the society owned slaves and had slaves working for them. And even in the African continent, when we read the Bible, we know that the Egyptians owned slaves and even enslaved the nation of Israel for 400 years, subjecting them to difficult and hard labor until God eventually intervened and set them free. So the concept of having slaves, owning slaves and having them work for you has always been in existence, even in the African continent before the Europeans even came to our shores in the 15th century. And there were different types of slaves. There were slaves that were taken as captives from war. In those days, when two kingdoms went for war, usually the victorious one would almost all the time take slaves and bring them back into his kingdom. And some of these slaves were really subjected to hard labor, and some of them were sold, some of them were even used as human sacrifices. A clear example is the story of the Ashanti people and the Dintra people. The Ashanti Empire was probably the most dominant ethnic group in the 16th or 17th century in the Gold Coast. Their military and economic power and their political power is dated back to their first king, Osei Tutu I, who was able to forge the Ashanti Empire by bringing together some subgroups and sub-communities and forming the Ashanti Empire around the 1670s to 1690s. And with the help of Okomfanochi, who was able to bring down the mysterious golden stool, which legitimized Osei Tutu's reign and authority as king over the Ashanti Empire. He also enacted the Ojura festival, which was a symbol of peace and unity among the Ashanti states. And during those times, the Ashanti were in constant warfare with the Dintra people. Dintra too was a force to reckon with, a very powerful state, a very powerful community at that time. But eventually the Ashantis were able to overcome the Dintra people, and through that conquest they brought a lot of Dintra people into the Ashanti kingdom and made some slaves in the Ashanti community or the Ashanti state. And you had other form of slaves as well. You had debt slaves. These were people that owed so much that the only way their debts could be paid was for them to be sold, or a family member of theirs to be sold as slaves. You also had criminal slaves. These were people that had committed some capital offenses, and the punishment was for them to be sold as slaves. So the concept of slavery and owning slave predates the coming of the Europeans to the Gold Coast. The concept and the institution was already in practice even before the Western people came to our shores. The first Europeans to arrive at Gold Coast were the Portuguese in 1471 in the 15th century. Upon their arrival, they found a lot of gold along the river Ankobia and the Volta, so they called those places the Mina, which meant the mines. They traded with the local people for almost 11 years until eventually they built their first castle, which is the Elmina Castle, to enhance their trading activities with the people. The Dutch also followed suit and also came to the Gold Coast to trade with the people. They also built some forts along the coastline. The notable one is probably the fort at Comenda. The Dutch were able to overtake the Elmina Castle and send the Portuguese packing. The British also came to trade with the local people. After some time, the Dutch ceded the authority and their castles and forts to the British, so making the British the only European country in the Gold Coast trading with the local people. So they eventually formed the Crown Colony, which brought all the coastal communities and towns under their political rule and power. Now, when the Europeans first came to the Gold Coast. They were trading with the local people in commodities such as gold, ivory, and pepper, until the late 15th century when the demand for slaves began to increase. Now, the reason why the demand for slaves began to overshadow the demand for gold and ivory was because the Europeans' plantations in the Americans were expanding, and so they wanted a lot of labor to go into those plantations to work for them. Now, the Indians were the initial people that were working in those plantations, but because of the difficult and harsh conditions that the Europeans were putting them through, most of the Indians began to die. So they started shifting their focus to Africa, and they streamlined their focus to West Africa to solicit labor and slaves from. They took slaves from Senegambia, from Sierra Leone, from the Windward Coast, from Gold Coast, from the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West African Central. An estimated of 12.4 million slaves were taken from West Africa to the Americans through the Middle Passage. These captured slaves were chained and put into slave ships to be transported from West Africa to the Americas. And many of the African slaves did not even survive the voyage because of the terrible and horrible conditions that these slave masters put them through. Some of the women were raped and tortured. Some of the men were killed and thrown overboard. Those who survived and got to the Americas were sold as slaves and were sent to the plantations to work in them. Now, there were three key players in the whole slave trade campaign. You have the Europeans, who have the resources, the African continent that produced the slave, and the Americans that produced the finished product. The Europeans will come to the African continent with textiles and firearms, trade with the African chiefs and African merchants for slaves, take the slaves to the Americas to work in those plantations to produce finished products like tobacco, wine, and sugar. Now, it is needful to say that some of the African chiefs were very active in the slave trade, and they made a lot of money from it. They sold slaves to the Europeans. Now, you have to understand that in those days, there was nothing like the African continent. So loyalty was limited to tribe members. So if you were not my tribe, or we were not of the same tribe, I could easily capture you and sell you as a slave. The Ashantis were very active, or the Ashanti kings were very active in the slave trade. They sold slaves to the Europeans in the coastal lines, and also sold slaves to the Muslim merchants in the north, who also took those slaves through the Sahara Desert into countries like India, Yemen, and Iraq. There were other African merchants who were also very notorious and very active in the slave trade and made a lot of money from it. And such merchants are John Cabs and Thomas Ewusi. We also need to understand that the first set of Europeans that came to the Gold Coast were not missionaries but merchants. They came with the sole purpose of trading with the local people. So they focused on trading rather than evangelization. And although they might have carried Bibles along, they did not practice the teachings that were in the Bible. It was late in the 19th century that the churches in Europe made systematic effort to send missionaries to the continent of Africa and to establish mission centers. So you have the first set of people that came in the 15th century who were merchants, and you have another set of people coming in the 19th century who were missionaries. The merchants started the slave trade. The missionaries fought against the slave trade. The merchants destroyed the African society. The missionaries helped build the African society. The merchants were greedy and selfish. The missionaries were selfless, and they practiced love. Some of them even gave themselves to die for the African people. So you have two sects of people. Each one carried the Bible to the African continent. And the impact that these missionaries had on the continent of Africa is so significant that it cannot be quantified. In their attempt to spread Christianity, they established schools to disseminate education. They built hospitals and care centers for the sick, the aged, and the weak in the society. They also laid the foundation for the African languages. In translating the Bible and some of these religious texts into the African languages, they laid the foundations for literature in the African languages. They played such a significant role. Some of them had to live among the Africans for all their life. We are talking about people like David Livingstone, who lived among the Africans all the time that he was in Africa, and helped the African people build their society. So yeah, in one stance, you have the first set of Europeans coming in the name of Christ to start slavery and to destroy the African society. You also have another bunch of the missionaries coming in the name of Christ to help build the African society. Another thing is that instead of being resentful and being angry at the Western people or the European countries for what they did some 500 years ago, we need to also understand that they were able to do what they did only because some African chiefs and some African leaders liaised with them and allowed them to come into our shores to take and to loot our resources. And that's exactly what is happening in our country now. You have chiefs, presidents and ministers of states that allow these Asians and these Europeans to come into our continent and take our resources and take everything that we have and take it back to their country, just because these chiefs and these ministers will benefit something for them, for themselves and their family, whilst the masses of the African people struggle to make ends meet. I think it's time we need to shake away the relics of old memory and come together as a continent, as a people, and trust forward, because I really believe that African is destined for greatness. And although the slave trade was terrible, yet the worst form of slavery is slavery to sin and to one's own desire. When you have a man that is bound by sin and is enslaved by his own desire, that man is the most piteous of all men. There are a lot of people who are wealthy, successful, beautiful, great looking, but they are bound by sin, bound by guilt, bound by fear and anxiety, and they can't set themselves free. There are many people who are addicted to drugs, addicted to sex, fornication, masturbation, pornography. They would want to be free, but they can't set themselves free because slave has become their master and they have been bound by the power and the enticement of sin. The only person that can save you and deliver you from that addiction and from that guilt and fear and anxiety is the person of Jesus Christ. When he comes into your life, he sets you free, and he sets you free indeed. And if only you will invite him to your life, you would really see the difference that he brings. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to share, to like, and to comment. See you next week.